I overheard my wife say, "I'm just a temporary choice until she finds someone better, so I got revenge." Imagine this, you're about to marry the love of your life, only to hear them say, "He's just a temporary choice until someone better comes along." I couldn't believe it. How would you react if the person you trusted most betrayed you like that? Stay with me, because in this story, you'll see how I turned the tables, and trust me, no one saw it coming. What would you have done? Comment your thoughts below. And keep watching to see how it all unfolded. I stared out at the city skyline, the lights glittering against the dark sky like a sea of distant stars. It should have been a perfect evening. I should have been relaxed, maybe nursing a glass of bourbon as I counted down the hours to my wedding day. Instead, I felt a knot tightening in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake, no matter how many times I told myself everything was going to be fine. This was supposed to be the happiest time of my life. Yet I couldn't stop my mind from racing. The air in my penthouse felt too still, too heavy, like the calm before a storm. I tried to convince myself it was just pre-wedding jitters. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. The last few days had been a whirlwind. Lena, my fiancée, had been staying at her family's estate, immersed in last-minute wedding preparations. I had told myself it was normal, she needed time with her bridesmaids, her parents, the whole Vaughn clan. I understood that. But in her absence, I'd been left with too much time to think. Too much time to replay the last few months over and over in my head, looking for cracks in the facade. I'd been too blind, or too willing to ignore. I swirled the amber liquid in my glass, watching the reflections ripple. Everything about this wedding was a production. A meticulously orchestrated event designed to impress the Vaughn family's friends, associates, and business partners. They were old money, after all, the kind that didn't just shine, it blinded you. Marrying into their world felt like stepping onto a stage, where every move had to be flawless, every line delivered perfectly. For Lena, this was her world. For me, it always felt like a performance. I loved her. At least, I thought I did. But lately, I couldn't help but wonder if she loved me or if I was just another piece on the Vaughn chessboard. A shadow crossed my reflection in the window, and I turned, startled, only to realize it was nothing more than the dimming city lights behind me. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. Paranoia wasn't going to help. I needed to focus on the good, on Lena, the woman I had spent the last 4 years building a life with. She was smart, beautiful, ambitious. That's what had drawn me to her in the first place. She had a fire in her eyes, a confidence that made everyone in the room stop and take notice. She wasn't just another society girl, she was a force. I had admired that. Hell, I'd fallen in love with it. But now, as the hours ticked closer to our wedding, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I was about to step into something I didn't fully understand. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me out of my thoughts. I picked it up, hoping for a message from Lena, some reassurance that everything was fine. But it was just another notification, a reminder about tomorrow's schedule. Ceremony at 2, reception at 4, the first dance, the speeches, the cake cutting, all planned down to the minute. It felt clinical, almost mechanical. I set the phone back down and leaned against the glass, the cool surface pressing against my forehead. Why did it feel like I was bracing for impact? I thought back to the first time I met Lena, at one of those charity galas her family was known for. She had been dazzling, her smile lighting up the room as she charmed everyone around her. I had been impressed not just by her looks, but by the way she carried herself. She wasn't like the other women at those events, the ones who giggled at every joke and clung to their father's names for credibility. Lena was sharp, quick-witted, and completely in control. I was hooked. Over the years, we built something that I thought was real. Late nights talking about our future. Weekends spent laughing over drinks with friends. Her hand slipping into mine, as we walked through Central Park. It had felt genuine, or at least I wanted to believe it was. But now, I wasn't so sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been missing something all along. The sound of a distant siren broke the silence, a faint wail rising and falling as it disappeared into the city's hum. I watched the lights from passing cars streak by on the avenue below, wondering if they were headed home to families, to loved ones. Was anyone else feeling this restless tonight, or was it just me? The weight on my chest pressed harder. My fingers tightened around the glass in my hand. I wasn't the type to dwell on doubts. I'd always been the guy who made decisions, who acted with confidence. But tonight, my confidence felt paper thin. I kept replaying the little moments, the times Lena had seemed distant, distracted. The late nights when she'd claimed she was working on wedding details. But her phone would buzz with a message she quickly dismissed. I hadn't thought much of it then. I trusted her. At least, I wanted to. But the pieces didn't fit anymore, and the picture they painted wasn't the one I'd been holding on to. I set the glass down on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood louder than I'd intended. My jaw tightened. I needed to shake this off. I needed to believe that tomorrow would be the start of something good, that everything I was feeling was just nerves. But I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my mind, the one that kept whispering that I was walking into something I didn't understand, something that could unravel everything I thought I knew. And as much as I wanted to silence it, that voice was growing louder. I didn't mean to overhear. That's what I keep telling myself. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just happened to be there at the wrong time, or maybe it was the right time, depending on how you look at it. I'd stopped by Lena's family's estate that evening, a last-minute gesture before the big day. I'd picked up a necklace from my safe earlier, a family heirloom my mother had pressed into my hands with a gentle smile, saying it would bring luck to our marriage. I wanted to surprise Lena with it, something small to remind her that I cared. So I drove over to the Vaughn estate, my heart a strange mix of anticipation and something I couldn't quite put my finger on. When I arrived, the house was buzzing with activity, as always. The staff greeted me by name. They knew who I was, soon to be part of their world, soon to be Lena's husband. They showed me in without hesitation, leading me toward her suite, where I figured I'd catch her putting the final touches on wedding plans. But as I approached, I heard voices. Hers, and someone else's. I couldn't see who it was, but the words stopped me cold. "He's just a temporary choice," Lena said, her tone cool, almost dismissive. "Until someone better comes along." For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air felt sucked out of the hallway, leaving only those words hanging in the silence. Temporary choice. Someone better. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Was she talking about me? About us? I wanted to believe I'd misheard, that I'd walked in on some joke, some offhand comment taken out of context. But the way she said it, calm, deliberate, left no room for doubt. I stood there, gripping the velvet box in my hand so tightly, I thought it might crush. It was as if the floor had shifted beneath me. Every moment, every memory, every promise we'd made suddenly felt like a lie. I had given her everything. I'd built a life for us, worked hard to be the kind of man she deserved. And now, on the eve of our wedding, I found out that I was just a placeholder, a convenient step on her ladder. Part of me wanted to burst into the room, to demand an explanation, to hear her try and justify those words. But another part of me held back. What would that accomplish? She'd deny it, twist it, spin a story that made me question what I'd heard. No. Confronting her wouldn't change what I already knew. It wouldn't make her love me. And so, I turned and walked away. My footsteps felt heavier with each step, the weight of those words pressing down on me like a physical force. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see her face, to see her smile, knowing what I now knew. Instead, I left the house, got in my car, and drove. I wasn't sure where I was going. The city lights blurred as I sped through the streets, my mind racing. My pulse pounded in my ears, a steady rhythm that matched the growing anger building inside me. I'd given her 4 years of my life. I'd trusted her. I'd believed in her. And now I was nothing more than a temporary choice. The word temporary echoed in my mind, each repetition twisting the knife a little deeper. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. My reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger's. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could handle anything, who could adapt, who could rise above. But this cut me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that I'd been blind, that I'd ignored the warning signs, that I'd let myself be played. When I finally stepped out of the car, the night air hit me like a slap. The streets were quiet, the city's usual hum muffled, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. I climbed the steps to my building, each one feeling heavier than the last, and unlocked the door to my penthouse. The silence inside was deafening. I didn't turn on the lights. Instead, I walked to the window, looking out at the skyline that had once felt so full of promise. Now, it felt cold, empty. I tried to piece it together, to understand how I'd missed it. Lena had always been ambitious. That was part of what drew me to her. She wasn't content with the status quo, she wanted more, and I admired that drive. But now I saw that drive for what it was, a willingness to do whatever it took, to use whoever she needed, to get ahead, and I'd been one of her tools. I felt a sick twist in my gut as I thought about all the times I'd defended her, all the times I'd told myself that her aloofness was just stress, that her coldness was just her way of coping. I'd made excuses for her because I wanted so badly to believe that we were real. I wanted to believe that what we had was worth fighting for. But the truth was staring me in the face now, and I couldn't look away. I poured myself a drink, the sound of the liquid hitting the glass cutting through the stillness. I took a long sip, the burn in my throat grounding me, giving me something tangible to hold on to. My mind shifted from despair to resolve. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't make Lena love me. But I could take control of the situation. I could make sure that she didn't get away with it. That she didn't walk down that aisle tomorrow with a smile on her face, pretending everything was perfect. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to be her pawn anymore. The words she'd spoken, those cold, cutting words, had shattered something inside me. But they'd also lit a fire I hadn't felt in years. A fire that told me I couldn't let this slide. That I couldn't let her think she'd won. I set the glass down and leaned against the counter, the cold surface grounding me. My mind was already racing through possibilities. I needed proof. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. I couldn't just walk away quietly. I'd built too much, sacrificed too much, to let her have the last word. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from panic anymore. It was from determination. I had one night to figure out how to turn this around. One night to take back control of my life. And as I stood there in the silence, I knew one thing for certain: tomorrow, everything would change. Now, let me ask you, if you heard the one person you loved say you were just temporary, what would you do? Would you confront them right away, or would you wait and plan your next move carefully? Comment 1 if you'd confront them immediately. Or comment 2 if you'd wait and see what happens next. I can't wait to hear what you think. After hearing Lena's words that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed more. The truth was out in the open now, but it wasn't enough. I needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence that would make it impossible for her to deny what she'd done. I wasn't just looking to clear my own conscience. I wanted everyone to see her for who she really was. And I wanted her to feel the consequences. That's when I made the call. I reached out to a private investigator I'd worked with before, a guy named Nate. He wasn't flashy, but he got the job done. More importantly, he was discreet. The kind of person who could dig into places no one else dared to look. I didn't want this to turn into a public spectacle, not yet, at least. But I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Nate was skeptical at first. "Jack," he said, his voice gruff over the phone, "you're getting married tomorrow. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "Just do it," I told him, my voice sharper than I intended. "Look into her. Find out everything you can." There was a pause, the kind that made me think he was weighing his options. Then he sighed. "All right, I'll get started tonight." Hanging up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Part of me was terrified of what he might find. The other part was desperate for it. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between love and betrayal. I needed to know the full scope of what Lena had been hiding. The waiting was excruciating. Every hour that passed felt like a lifetime. I tried to distract myself, watched TV, cleaned the apartment, even went for a run, but nothing worked. My mind kept circling back to that moment outside her room. The sound of her voice. The way she'd so casually dismissed me as a temporary choice. That memory was a weight on my chest, and I couldn't seem to shake it. I was barely home from my run when Nate called back. His voice was even, almost too calm. "Jack, I found something," he said. My stomach clenched. "What is it?" "Lena's got some offshore accounts. A lot of money moving around, more than I'd expect for someone who's supposed to be marrying into your finances. It's not just the amount that's weird, it's the timing. These transfers have been happening for a while, long before you popped the question." I felt the blood drain from my face. How much are we talking? Let's just say it's enough to raise a lot of questions, Nate replied. And it's not just the accounts. I looked into her business dealings. There are some questionable partnerships companies that don't really exist. Shell corporations funneling money. This isn't just about her stepping out on you, Jack. This is bigger. I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning. Money laundering? Fraud? How deep did this go? Nate's voice cut through my thoughts. I'll send you the files. You'll want to see this for yourself. When the documents came through, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Transactions from companies I'd never heard of. Wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Payments labeled as consulting fees that didn't add up. The more I read, the clearer it became. Lena wasn't just unfaithful. She was running a game I hadn't even known I was playing. My anger grew with each page. I had worked hard for everything I had. Built my company from the ground up. And here she was, treating me like a mark, like some gullible fool she could bleed dry. I'd always known she came from money, but I hadn't realized just how cutthroat her world was. The Vaughn family didn't just deal in wealth, they dealt in power. And Lena had been groomed to wield that power in whatever way suited her best. I closed the laptop and stared out the window, my chest heaving. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. I couldn't let her pull me under. I had to protect myself, my company, my reputation. And if that meant exposing her, then so be it. But how? The question gnawed at me. I couldn't just show up at the wedding and start throwing around accusations. I needed to be smart, strategic. I needed to wait for the perfect moment to strike. When all eyes would be on her. When there would be no escape, no chance to spin the story in her favor. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, replaying everything in my head. The moments that had seemed so perfect now felt like a carefully crafted illusion. The woman I thought I loved wasn't real. She was a mask, and I'd finally glimpsed what lay underneath. The next morning, as the city came to life outside my window, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I wasn't going to let her use me and move on to the next target. I had the evidence. I had the truth. And soon, everyone else would have it too. Lena had been playing a dangerous game, and now it was my turn to play. Only this time, I wasn't going to lose. The more I dug into Lena's family, the more the whole situation started to feel like a carefully staged production. The Vaughns weren't just wealthy, they were powerful. The kind of people who didn't just open doors. They built the damn buildings and handed out the keys. I'd known that going in. I wasn't blind to their status. But what I hadn't realized until now was how deep their control ran, how their influence shaped not just their own lives but everyone else's orbiting around them. And Lena wasn't just a product of that world, she was an active participant. I thought I'd understood who she was. I thought I'd been able to separate the person I loved from the dynasty she came from. But now I was starting to see that there was no separating them. Every decision she made, every step she took, was steeped in the Vaughn legacy, in their endless pursuit of more power, more prestige, more wealth. I'd thought I was marrying a woman, but it felt like I was walking straight into a family business deal. One where I wasn't an equal partner. I was a bargaining chip. I started thinking back to the dinners we'd had with her parents, Gerard and Anne Vaughn. Gerard was always polite, always quick with a handshake and a smile. But there was a coldness beneath it, a calculated weight behind every word. He'd pat my shoulder and tell me what a great match Lena and I were. How excited he was to welcome me into the family. At the time, I'd taken it as approval, as a sign that I was on the right path. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, it all felt like a game. The Vaughns knew exactly what they were doing. They saw me as a piece on the board, a way to solidify their position. And I'd walked right into it. I remembered one night in particular, a private dinner at the Vaughn estate. Gerard had invited me into his study, after dessert. It was a massive room, all dark wood and leather, with bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling. He poured me a glass of whiskey, the good stuff, and handed it to me without a word. Then he stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, as if he were searching for the right way to start. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Jack, I have to admit, I wasn't sure about you at first. Lena's brought home a few suitors over the years, and most of them were, well, let's just say they didn't quite fit." He paused, giving me a small, tight smile. "But you You've proven yourself. You've built something impressive. I respect that. At the time, those words had felt like validation. I'd worked so hard to build my company from the ground up, to become someone worthy of standing next to Lena. But now I realized it wasn't validation, it was confirmation. I'd passed whatever test he'd set. I was useful to them. Useful to Lena. I wasn't her partner in life. I was her investment. Thinking about that moment made my stomach turn. I wanted to believe that Lena had chosen me because she loved me, because she saw something in me beyond my success. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw how every part of our relationship had been carefully crafted. Even the way she'd introduced me to her parents at a charity gala, where I'd just donated a substantial sum, was calculated. Lena wasn't bringing home a boyfriend. She was presenting a candidate. And I'd passed the interview. It was infuriating. I'd spent years working to become the kind of man who could stand beside someone like Lena, not realizing that it had never been about who I was. It was about what I could do for her, for them. I was the outsider they'd brought in, polished up, and put on display. And when Lena called me her temporary choice, it all clicked into place. I wasn't her partner. I was her placeholder. I started to see the Vaughn's fingerprints on everything. The way Lena always deferred to her father when it came to major decisions. The way she'd push me to attend certain events, meet certain people. The way she'd brush off my questions with that dazzling smile and a kiss, redirecting my focus before I could dig any deeper. It wasn't just her. It was all of them. They had been grooming me from the start, and I'd been too blind, or maybe just too trusting, to see it. I couldn't shake the image of Gerard standing in front of that fireplace, his glass of whiskey in hand, looking at me like I was some prized possession he'd just acquired. And Lena, sitting in the other room with her mother, laughing softly as they planned our wedding. A wedding that wasn't about us. It was about them. About what they could gain. I felt a sick twist in my gut. I'd let myself believe that Lena loved me, that we were building something real. But now I saw the truth. The Vaughns didn't build relationships. They built empires. And I was just another brick in the wall. The anger that had been simmering inside me since I overheard Lena's words began to boil over. I'd been so focused on proving myself, on earning their approval, that I'd ignored the signs. I'd let them use me. But that stopped now. I wasn't going to let them dictate my life anymore. I wasn't going to let them control me. I wasn't just some stepping stone on Lena's path to bigger and better things. If the Vaughns wanted to play games, then fine. I'd play. But I'd play by my rules. It was time to take back control. I wasn't going to let them win. I didn't want to believe it, not at first. I tried to tell myself there had to be another explanation, some miscommunication, a misunderstanding. But the more I thought about it, the more everything started to line up. Every doubt I'd buried, every moment I'd shrugged off, came rushing back, clearer than ever. The time Lena canceled our anniversary dinner because she had a work thing, only to post photos later that night at a cocktail party with her father's business partners. The nights she spent at the Vaughn estate, claiming she needed to finalize details with her family, while I sat alone in my penthouse, wondering why she wasn't answering her phone. The little excuses, the subtle evasions, they all painted a picture I hadn't been willing to see. Lena wasn't just distant. She was deliberate, calculated, and I had been too in love, too blind to notice. I thought back to when we first got engaged. It had been a whirlwind moment, one that felt spontaneous and perfect at the time. I'd proposed during a weekend getaway in Napa, at a small vineyard overlooking the valley. I'd been nervous, but excited, because I truly believed we were building something together. Lena had said all the right things. She looked surprised, overjoyed, like she'd been waiting for me to take that step. But now, with everything I'd learned, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been part of her plan. Maybe she wasn't surprised at all. Maybe she'd been counting on it. I went over every interaction we'd had in the weeks leading up to the engagement. The subtle hints she'd dropped about our future. The way she'd introduced me to her father's associates, as if she was already preparing me for a larger role in their world. It all seemed so natural then, so genuine. But looking back, I could see how carefully she'd guided the conversation, how she'd made sure I felt confident enough to propose. Lena wasn't the kind of person who waited for life to happen to her. She made it happen. And now, I realized, she'd made me happen. It was a gut punch. I'd thought our love was real solid. I'd believed every word she'd said, every promise she'd made. But now, it felt like those moments had been scripted, rehearsed for my benefit. The laughter we'd shared, the late night talks about our dreams, even the way she'd looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, had all of it been fake? Was I just another player in her game, a game I hadn't even known I was part of? I tried to shake off the memories, but they stuck to me like a bad smell. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the scene outside her room that night. The sound of her voice so calm, so casual as she called me her temporary choice. The words echoed in my head, turning over and over, until they no longer sounded like words, but the crack of a door slamming shut. I wanted to be angry God. I wanted to scream, to punch a wall, to make her understand how much she'd hurt me. But more than that, I wanted answers. I wanted to know why. Why had she chosen me in the first place? Why had she let me believe we were building a future together, only to treat me like I was disposable? I thought about the times we'd spent at the Vaughn estate, the way her family looked at me. I'd assumed their approval was genuine, that they saw me as a good match for Lena. But now I realized they'd never truly cared about me. They'd cared about what I could bring to the table, about how I could elevate their position. Lena had used me, but so had they. I wasn't just marrying a woman, I was marrying a legacy. And I didn't fit into their plans beyond the short term. I started piecing together all the subtle ways Lena had distanced herself. The way she never let me see her vulnerable. The way she avoided talking about her past, her fears, her doubts. She kept everything at arm's length, presenting only the parts of herself she wanted me to see. It wasn't that I didn't know her, I just didn't know all of her. I knew the version she wanted me to love. The one that smiled and laughed and talked about building a life together. But now I saw the cracks in that facade. I saw the parts she'd hidden away. The parts that whispered I was never meant to be permanent. The anger simmered inside me, not the hot, blinding rage I expected, but a cold, steady burn. It wasn't just that she'd lied. It was that she'd done it so effortlessly, so convincingly. She'd made me believe in something that wasn't real, and that made me question everything. Had I been a fool for trusting her? Or had she been so good at playing the part that no one could have seen through it? Either way, I couldn't let it go. I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard what I'd heard. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine. I thought about confronting her. What would she say? Would she deny it? Tell me I'd misheard? Spin some excuse that made me second guess myself? Or would she admit it, look me in the eye and tell me I'd been a means to an end? I didn't know which possibility was worse. Part of me wanted to storm into the Vaughn estate, demand the truth right then and there. But another part of me held back. What good would it do? She wouldn't suddenly change. She wouldn't suddenly love me the way I'd hoped. She'd only find a way to twist the story, to make herself the victim and me the villain. And I couldn't let that happen. Instead, I stayed silent. I kept my thoughts to myself, kept my suspicions under wraps. But inside, I was unraveling. The future I thought I was building with Lena was crumbling. And I didn't know what was left. I felt like a stranger in my own life. Like everything I'd worked for had been stripped away. I was angry, yes. But I was also lost. I didn't know who I was without the relationship I thought we had. I didn't know what to do next. But one thing was clear, I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep going through the motions, smiling and nodding while the foundation of our life together rotted beneath me. Something had to change. I had to change. Because if I didn't, I'd lose myself entirely. And that was something I couldn't afford. That night, I sat in my apartment, the city lights flickering outside, while the weight of everything I'd learned pressed down on me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a dark, bottomless void. My mind wouldn't stop racing, piecing together the puzzle of Lena's lies, her family's manipulation, and my own blind trust. How had I missed the signs? How had I let myself fall into their trap so easily? The questions swirled around in my head, each one heavier than the last, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I poured myself another drink, hoping the burn of the bourbon would dull the ache in my chest. It didn't. Nothing did. I kept thinking about how Lena had played me, how her family had treated me like I was just another piece on their chessboard. I wasn't a person to them, I was a tool. A pawn. A means to an end. And the worst part was, I'd let them do it. I'd trusted Lena. I'd believed in her. I'd loved her. And now, all of that was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness that I couldn't shake. The apartment felt suffocating. I needed air. Grabbing my jacket, I headed down to the street, the cool night air hitting my face as I stepped outside. The city was still alive. Cars rushing by. People moving through their own lives. Completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I started walking, letting my feet carry me wherever they wanted to go. I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, my mind was too preoccupied. All I could think about was how everything had fallen apart, how the future I'd envisioned with Lena had turned into a lie. As I walked, I thought about the nights we'd spent together, the plans we'd made, the promises we'd shared. Had any of it been real? Or had she been lying to me from the start? I thought back to the first time I met her family. I'd been nervous, eager to make a good impression, to prove that I was worthy of her. But now, I saw it for what it was, an audition. I'd jumped through their hoops, played my part, and they'd accepted me not because they liked me, but because I fit their agenda. They didn't care about me. They only cared about what I could offer them. And Lena, she was no different. My hands clenched into fists as I walked, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. I didn't want to be angry. I didn't want to feel anything at all, but I couldn't help it. The betrayal cut too deep. I thought about confronting Lena, about demanding answers, about making her admit what she'd done. But what good would it do? She'd just lie. Or worse, she'd tell the truth, and I'd have to hear her say that I was never enough, that I was just a temporary choice. That would hurt more than any lie ever could. I stopped at a small park, the quiet space offering a brief respite from the chaos in my head. I sat on a bench, staring out at the empty playground, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. I felt like one of those swings, pushed around by forces I couldn't control, unable to steady myself. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind, but it didn't work. The memories kept flooding back, unrelenting. I thought about the times Lena and I had laughed together, the moments that had felt so genuine, so real. Were they real? Or had she been faking it all along? I didn't know what to believe anymore. I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. My faith in her and in myself completely shattered. I didn't know who I was without her. I didn't know how to move forward. But one thing I did know, I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. I couldn't ignore what I'd learned. As the night wore on, the city around me began to quiet down, the streets growing emptier. I sat on that bench for what felt like hours, lost in my thoughts, my emotions swinging wildly between anger, sadness, and confusion. I wanted to feel numb, to push it all away, but I couldn't. The truth was out there now, and there was no running from it. Eventually, I stood and started walking again, my steps aimless but steady. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in the place I was. I couldn't keep pretending. I had to find a way to move forward, even if I didn't know what that looked like yet. I had to take control of my life, to reclaim the parts of myself that Lena and her family had tried to take. And as I walked through the quiet city streets, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let them define me. I wouldn't let them win. The morning of the wedding arrived, and I was wide awake long before dawn. I stood in my penthouse, looking out at the city skyline, the sun just beginning to bleed over the horizon. My chest felt tight, not from nerves about the ceremony, but from the weight of what I was about to do. The documents I'd uncovered were sitting on the table behind me, neatly stacked and organized. The evidence was all their financial records, emails, bank transfers that painted a clear picture of Lena's betrayal. It had taken hours to gather everything, but now I had it. Now, I could finally confront the truth, and make sure the world saw Lena for who she really was. I'd gone through every possible scenario in my mind. I'd imagined confronting her in private, just the two of us, giving her a chance to explain. I'd imagined sitting down with her family, laying the evidence on the table, watching their carefully composed faces crumble. But each time, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Lena would find a way to twist it, to shift blame, to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong. She was too skilled at playing the victim, too good at spinning stories. No, this had to be public. It had to be undeniable. It had to be at the wedding. I turned away from the window and glanced at my tuxedo hanging on the back of a chair. I'd had it tailored weeks ago, when everything still felt certain. Back then, I'd been excited for this day. I'd thought it was the beginning of a new chapter, A partnership built on love and trust. Now, it felt like a costume, a uniform I'd wear to face my opponent on the battlefield. Because that's what it was now. This wasn't a wedding. This was a reckoning. I tried to eat something, but the thought of food turned my stomach. Instead, I poured myself a coffee and sat at the table, staring at the stack of documents again. My mind was buzzing with every moment that had led me to this point. The night I overheard Lena calling me a temporary choice. The hours spent poring over bank statements and emails, uncovering the trail of deceit. The realization that this wasn't just a personal betrayal, but a calculated manipulation. Lena hadn't just lied to me, she'd used me. I was never her partner. I was her pawn. As the morning ticked by, I went over my plan again and again. The ceremony was set for noon at a grand estate just outside the city. Hundreds of guests would be there, friends, family, business associates, journalists. It was the perfect stage. I'd let the ceremony begin as planned. Let everyone take their seats. Let Lena walk down the aisle. And then, when the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, I'd speak up. I'd step forward, documents in hand, and lay it all out. I'd tell the truth about her lies, her financial schemes, her betrayal. I'd let everyone see the evidence for themselves. There would be no denying it. The Vaughns would be exposed. Lena would be exposed. Part of me felt sick at the thought of it. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't the type of man to cause a scene, to air dirty laundry in public. But what choice did I have? If I stayed silent, Lena would continue to manipulate and deceive. She'd move on to her next target, her next scheme. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let her win. As the clock crept closer to noon, I got dressed. The tuxedo felt stiff, almost foreign. I looked at myself in the mirror, adjusting the bow tie, and hardly recognized the man staring back. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I first met Lena. I wasn't the same person who'd proposed to her, who'd dreamed of a life together. That man was gone. What was left was someone harder, someone colder, someone who knew what he had to do, even if it meant burning everything down. I arrived at the estate early, before most of the guests. The staff was bustling around, making final preparations, adjusting flower arrangements, setting out champagne glasses. No one paid me much attention as I made my way inside. The grand ballroom was already set up, rows of white chairs facing a floral-covered arch at the end of the aisle. I stood at the back of the room, watching as the first few guests began to trickle in. They were all smiles, dressed to the nines, chatting about how beautiful the day was, how perfect the couple was. I felt a pang of anger rise in my chest. They didn't know. They didn't see what I saw. I kept my distance, staying in the shadows, observing. Gerard Vaughn was already there, greeting guests, shaking hands, exuding confidence. He had no idea what was coming. Anne Vaughn was fussing over the seating chart, making sure everything was just right. And Lena, she hadn't arrived yet. She was probably upstairs, getting ready, surrounded by her bridesmaids, preparing to walk down the aisle and seal her perfect little deal. The minutes dragged on. The room filled with more guests, the hum of conversation growing louder. I felt the weight of the documents in my pocket, the edges pressing against my leg like a constant reminder of what I was about to do. My hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. I took a deep breath, then another. I wasn't nervous, not exactly. It was something else. A kind of tension, a sense of inevitability. I wasn't backing out. I couldn't. But the gravity of it all was hitting me, harder than I expected. Finally, the time came. The officiant took his place at the front of the room. The music started, soft and melodic, and the guests began to settle into their seats. I stayed at the back, my heart pounding as the bridal party began to walk down the aisle. One by one, the bridesmaids and groomsmen filed in, smiling and poised. And then, the music swelled. The doors at the end of the aisle opened, and there she was. Lena appeared, radiant in her wedding gown, her smile bright, her eyes shining. She looked every bit the picture-perfect bride. The guests gasped softly, a few murmurs of admiration rippling through the crowd. But as I watched her walk down the aisle, I didn't feel admiration. I felt anger. I felt betrayal. I felt resolve. This was it. This was the moment. I straightened my tie, steadied my breath, and prepared to do what needed to be done. Lena reached the front, took her place beside me, and the officiant began to speak. His words barely registered. My mind was focused on what came next. I knew when to step forward. I knew when to speak. I knew what to say. As the officiant reached the part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone had any objections, the room fell silent. My heart thundered in my chest. This was my cue. This was the moment that would change everything. I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and cleared my throat. I didn't hesitate. The moment the officiant asked the question, I stepped forward. I object, I said, my voice steady and clear. The room froze. A murmur rippled through the guests, followed by a stunned silence. Lena turned to me, her eyes wide, a flicker of panic breaking through her carefully composed facade. This was it. No turning back now. Jack, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What are you doing? I ignored her and turned to face the room. Hundreds of faces stared back at me, a mix of shock, confusion, and disbelief. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression calm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the stack of documents, holding them up so everyone could see. There are things you all need to know, I said. My voice carried through the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. Things Lena has been hiding. Things the first only recently discovered. The murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back of the room gasped. Gerard Vaughn stood up from his seat, his face red with anger. Jack, this is highly inappropriate. He barked. Inappropriate? The first shot back. What's inappropriate is what Lena has done. What your family has done. I've kept quiet for too long, but I can't do it anymore. I turned back to Lena. She was frozen, her face pale, her hands clutching her bouquet tightly. She looked at me, then at her father, then back at me. Please, she whispered. Not here, not now. But I wasn't about to back down. Everyone here deserves to know the truth, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Lena and her family have been using me, manipulating me. I thought I was building a life with someone I loved, but I was wrong. It was all a lie. A collective gasp swept through the room. I held up the documents again. This is proof, I said, shaking the papers slightly. Proof of financial manipulation, fraud, offshore accounts things. Lena has been orchestrating behind the scenes. I was never her partner. I was her pawn. The weight of my words hung heavy in the air. I could see the shock on people's faces, the dawning realization that this wasn't just some dramatic outburst. This was real. I stepped closer to Lena, my voice softening but losing none of its edge. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked. Why didn't you tell me the truth? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't let it sway me. Not this time. I'd spent too long ignoring the signs, too long letting her excuses slide. I couldn't let her off the hook now. The officiant, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally spoke. Perhaps we should. Stay right there, I interrupted, my gaze never leaving Lena. This needs to be said. Everyone here needs to understand what's really going on. I turned back to the crowd, taking a deep breath. I know some of you might be thinking I'm just bitter, that I'm acting out because of a personal betrayal. But it's more than that. Lena has been hiding things that could ruin lives, destroy reputations. I trusted her. I loved her. And she took that trust and used it to further her own agenda. The murmurs started again, louder this time. I could see people whispering to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief and sympathy. Gerard Vaughn stepped forward, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Jack, you've made your point. Sit down, and let's discuss this privately. I shook my head. No, Gerard. This is exactly the kind of thing you and your family always do, keep everything behind closed doors. Sweep the truth under the rug. Not this time. Not today. Lena finally spoke, her voice shaking. Jack, please stop. Stop. I said, my voice rising. I stopped asking questions for far too long. I stopped seeing the truth right in front of me. But not anymore. I turned back to the room, scanning the faces of the guests. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's ever trusted this family, who's ever believed in their carefully constructed image. You all deserve to know the truth. My voice softened as I addressed them. I didn't come here today to destroy anyone's life. I came here because I can't keep living a lie. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. that Lena is someone she's not. I loved her. I wanted a future with her. But that future was built on deception. I let my words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. I'm not saying this to hurt anyone. I'm saying it because the truth matters. Because people deserve to know what's really going on. And because I can't let her walk down that aisle, look me in the eye, and say vows she doesn't mean. Lena's tears were falling freely now, but I didn't look away. I felt a pang of sadness, of loss, but it was buried under the weight of everything she had done. I had to see this through. I had to let her face the consequences of her choices. I know some of you will judge me for doing this, I said, my voice firm. I know this will change the way you see me, the way you see Lena, the way you see her family. But I won't stand here and let her manipulate me or any of you any longer. The room was silent, except for the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat. The weight of my words settled over the crowd, the reality sinking in. I knew I couldn't fix everything with one speech. But I had taken the first step. I had taken back control. I lowered the documents and turned to the officiant. There's no wedding today, I said quietly. Not like this. Then I turned back to Lena. I'm sorry, I said, and for the first time, I truly meant it, not because I'd hurt her, but because of what we'd both lost. But I can't do this. I stepped away, leaving her standing there, surrounded by a room full of people who had believed the same lie I had. As I walked down the aisle and out of the room, I felt the weight begin to lift. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. As I stepped out into the cold afternoon air, I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. The doors to the Vaughn estate closed behind me with a dull thud, muffling the murmurs and gasps of the guests still inside. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp, clean air, letting the quiet surround me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel trapped. I didn't feel like I was suffocating under the expectations of Lena, her family, or the carefully curated image of a life we'd been pretending to build. All I felt was freedom. I took a step down the marble staircase, my polished shoes clicking softly against the stone, and then another. Each step forward felt lighter, as if I was leaving behind the lies, the betrayal, and the anger that had consumed me for so long. The cars lined up along the circular drive glinted in the afternoon sun, and I could see a few of the guests through the windows, their faces still frozen in shock, still trying to process what had just happened. A part of me felt guilty for exposing Lena so publicly, but that part was small, buried under the overwhelming need to reclaim my life. By the time I reached my car, my heart had settled into a steady rhythm. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment. I glanced back at the estate in the rearview mirror, a sprawling, ornate mansion that had always felt more like a gilded cage than a home. I thought about the years I'd spent walking through those halls, trying to fit into their world, convincing myself that I belonged. But the truth was, I never had. And now, I didn't have to try anymore. The engine purred to life, and I pulled out onto the long, winding driveway. The trees lining the road swayed gently in the breeze, their branches bare against the gray sky. As I drove, the estate faded from view, replaced by the open road stretching ahead. It felt symbolic, in a way, leaving behind the past, the deceit, and the weight of a life that had never truly been mine. I rolled down the window, letting the wind whip through my hair, and turned up the radio. The familiar strains of an old rock song filled the car, and for the first time in months, I caught myself smiling. The city loomed in the distance, its skyscrapers rising up like steel and glass mountains. I headed downtown, not entirely sure where I was going, but knowing I needed to move. To keep moving. I passed familiar landmarks, the park where Lena and I used to walk, the little cafe where we'd had our first date, the boutique hotel where I'd proposed. Each one triggered a memory, but the sting that had once accompanied them was fading. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was just ready. Ready to move on. I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner I hadn't been to in years. It wasn't fancy, just a hole-in-the-wall spot with neon lights buzzing above the door and a hand-painted sign that read Joe's. I remembered coming here in my 20s, when life was simpler, before I'd started chasing success and getting tangled up in the Vaughn's world. I slid into a booth by the window and ordered a black coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, A woman in her 50s with a warm smile and a name tag that said Marge set the plate in front of me and gave me a knowing look. Rough day, on? I chuckled softly. You could say that. Marge nodded, her pencil hovering over her notepad. Well, you're in the right place. Nothing a little pie and coffee can't fix. I thanked her and took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, bitter, and exactly what I needed. The pie was warm and sweet, the crust flaky and buttery. As I ate, I looked out the window at the cars passing by, the pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalk, the world continuing on, as if nothing had happened. And in that moment, I realized that was the point. Life would keep going, with or without me. It wasn't about what Lena had done, or what I'd lost. It was about what I chose to do next. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the endless messages and missed calls. Gerard had called 6 times. Lena's mother had left 3 voicemails. My lawyer had sent me a dozen emails. I let out a long sigh, set the phone down, and looked out the window again. I wasn't ready to deal with any of it yet. I needed time to breathe, to think, to figure out what came next. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I was free to make my own choices. I wasn't tied to Lena, her family, or their expectations. I could walk away from all of it and start fresh. As I sat there, sipping my coffee, I thought about the things that mattered to me. Not the money, not the status, not the image of the perfect life. What mattered was finding something real. Something that couldn't be bought or manipulated. I thought about the people I'd lost touch with. The passions I'd set aside. The dreams I'd buried under the weight of trying to be someone I wasn't. Maybe it was time to reconnect, to rediscover those parts of myself that had been overshadowed by the chaos of the past few years. Marge came by with a coffee refill, and I thanked her with a smile. You don't have to look so serious, on, she said. The world's still turning. Whatever happened, it's not the end of the world. I nodded. You're right. It's not. And for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it. As I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and stepped back out into the chilly afternoon, I felt a sense of possibility. The city stretched out before me, alive and humming with potential. I didn't know what was next, but I knew I'd figure it out. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was just living one step, one day at a time. Wow. Did you expect that to happen? I never imagined that turning the tables would feel this satisfying. But what do you think? Was I justified? Or did I go too far? Comment your thoughts below. And don't forget to like and share this video if you want to see more jaw-dropping stories just like this one. It's simple. Don't let anyone, no matter how charming or powerful they seem, manipulate you into losing sight of who you are. Trust is earned, not freely given. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I learned the hard way that being honest with yourself, even when the truth hurts, is better than living a lie. Integrity matters more than appearances, and the truth will always come out. In America, we pride ourselves on fairness, on giving everyone a chance to build their lives. But we have to start with ourselves. Be honest, be strong, and never let anyone take your worth away.